Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Practitioners Podcast, where we're applying Jesus-style disciple making to everyday life. This episode and all of our episodes are powered by Navigators Church Ministries, which focus on helping churches make disciples who can make disciples. For more information or to get connected, go to navigatorschurchministries.org. Friends, today on the podcast, we're talking about a big problem in big churches, right? And I love this dialogue. We're going to talk about mega churches. We're going to talk about how disciple making works inside of them. We're going to talk about some of their unique challenges, and we're going to talk about why it matters. So listen, if you're a small church pastor and you're like, I'm going to turn this off, don't. Because the truth is that it's really easy for any of these problems to pop up in any organization. Some of them just seem to happen a little bit more frequently in big churches. Justin, am I saying that right? What are we getting into today?
Yeah, so disciple making in mega churches. Now, this conversation's a little bit different than anything we've done before, but kind of our intention with it is we're not trying to represent all types of mega churches, right? Even within big churches, there's churches that are like 2,000, churches that are like 20,000, right? There's no possible way that we're going to be talking about something that is relevant to every one of those sizes. But what we will be talking about are the normal challenges that are in front of them and some of the normal things that they would need to do in order to develop a disciple-making culture that will thrive in the midst of that larger church context. Now, as a listener, you might have in your mind, a number of, well, that's a mega church to you. And that's okay. We're not going to try and define it out of a mega church is this many people. Although generally speaking, we're talking about churches in the thousands, not churches in the hundreds, right? And so, as we move through this, I think that as you listen, you will get a picture of okay, these are some of the things that are true in those larger church contexts. And these are some of the things that we need to look out for, that we need to consider if we're going to move from a church that, just kind of does church-like things to a church that really builds and sends out disciple makers.
Let me also say this, is that I've had the privilege of working in a mega church and then working in some non-mega church experiences. So I want you to know that I'm talking about this as a practitioner, and I know personally the struggles of both sides. And we'll get into more of that as we get into the episode. But just here, we're not disparaging any size church.
Yep.
We want every church to be a disciple-making church.
Amen.
And we want to help do whatever we can do to kind of push that mission forward. I'm in a church right now, a size of about 300, but at one point in my career, it was about 3,000 on another church. So it varies, right? Experiences may vary, and that's true for every pastor, church leader, lay person who's pushing a disciple-making culture.
Yep. Let's start our conversation, Tony, with a story, a true story right out of Chicago. There's a mega church called Willow Creek, and that's a church probably most of our listeners are familiar with. The leader of Willow Creek, and this was a church that was one of the most booming churches in all of America in the 90s and early 2000s. And it kind of operated under an assumption that if they create excellent weekend services with compelling environments and clear on-ramps, people will naturally grow as disciples the more that they engage. And that kind of worked, right? In terms of people kept coming in, and it kind of... the implication was, hey, if you get them here, we'll take it from there. And so the job of the person in the pew was to not only keep coming, but invite your friends, invite your friends, invite your friends. They have compelling worship experiences, et cetera, et cetera. And, again, by some metrics, it worked really well. Now, their leader, a guy named Bill Hybels, who has since, had some troubles, and we don't want to emulate all the things, right? But at this point, he, to his credit, made an observation along with his team and said publicly, hey, we made a mistake. And what he meant was not that the programs were bad or that trying to do excellent Sunday worship experiences was bad, but that they said essentially they'd unintentionally trained people to be consumers. And that this belief that they had that the more people attended, the more they would grow in maturity just ended up being wrong. And they had to rethink some of those assumptions. And some of those assumptions were, that attendance would lead to transformation. that engagement would lead to ownership and that activity would lead to discipleship in Jesus. And again, it just didn't work. And this presents one of the key challenges of the mega church is that what we've found not only in Willow Creek but in other mega churches is you can leverage certain things and get people to be there and to get people to be a part of this experience as a church and as a mega church, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are growing closer to Jesus. And thus it presents kind of a dilemma for the leaders of those churches because now what you have is you have a population of people who maybe weren't being engaged before. And now they're being engaged and they're in the conversation, they're in the building around these Jesus things, around the scriptures. And leaders have to make these decisions of, well, what is the goal? Is the goal just to get them here and to get them around? Or is the goal to get them to become disciples and disciple makers? And if we're having them here and around, is that actually leading them to that greater goal that I think even the megachurch leaders that I know, they would say, well, no, of course we want them to be disciples and disciple makers. But it's that tension there of, well, they're here. Is that better than them not being anywhere? And how do we get them from being here to being a disciple and a disciple maker? Tony, from your experience kind of working in the megachurch, did you experience any of that tension? And what did you observe in terms of when you were on staff of a megachurch?
Sure. One of the things that I wouldn't have known at the time that I would say now is that, and this is a quote from my friend Matt Reynolds. He says that what you win them with is what you win them to. And so inadvertently, when you're trying to create what some people would call an attractional church model, you're creating a culture that says, come and see, not come and own. And that difference is so hard to overcome because as fast as people come in is as fast as they leave. And unfortunately, at scale, it becomes so hard to get into that personal, relational, intentional kind of relationships that you and I both know pushes people towards disciple making. And so you bring somebody in under the guise of big events, which are important, right? And big things to do, which are important. Big baptism weekends, which again are super important, right? You don't want to get rid of any of those, but it's very hard to then switch gears. I'll never forget a time when I was doing a life group leader training and the church was kind of at an inflection point. It continued to grow in numbers and we needed communities to put these people in. And so I gave this, if I do say so myself, this really awesome life group leader training. It was all about being a servant leader. I got a raft. It was like servant leadership, steering from the back, use the power. It was good. That's still one of my best trainings, but it was good. It was good. I had to do a lot of work to get that raft on the platform. And at the end, it was a call to action to say, who's ready to step in and be a leader?
Yeah.
120 life groups. Maybe a 1,000 people in life groups total. There were probably 300-ish people in the room. Nobody came forward for the training.
Wow.
No one came forward to accept the call of the training, the call to action, as we would say, right? And maybe the training wasn't as good as I thought. I'm willing to accept that. I also want to suggest that maybe we just didn't have a culture that said, if you're here, you're called to be an owner of the faith.
Yeah.
And again, that's no one's fault. That's not a blame. It's just a reality of the situation is that we got so big that people could just come in and consume and they weren't really part of pushing a new culture forward.
Yeah. Yep. That makes sense. And I think it's a common challenge in megachurches is, there's this almost a confirmation loop. And in terms of Navigators Church Ministries and the work that we do, part of the struggle of engaging mega churches is they often don't see a need for help in disciple making because they believe that people being there is evidence that they are making disciples. And that's what, Willow Creek came to that point of like, well, no, these two aren't the same. But when attendance is up and giving is strong and there's all these stories flying around, people saying, oh, this is so great and it's really helping me. And, we can believe those things. There's no reason to doubt any of those. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that people are becoming owners, that they're becoming disciple makers. Now, the other thing, Tony, in mega churches is most of the time they have grown to such a size because they've really mastered systems. They've figured out how to execute systems really well. And that comes from a good place, right? They're thinking of like, well, how do we serve all these people that are coming? How do we reduce friction so that these newcomers don't get lost in the shuffles? How do we mobile? We have such a need for volunteers everywhere. How do we mobilize people and get them in the right spots so that they can move from attending to, contributing, even if it's in a small way? Like, how do we do these things? And part of the struggle of these big systems is disciple making doesn't thrive with systems. It
Yeah.
thrives in relationships. It thrives in the person to person, the smaller rather than the macro environments. It thrives in micro environments. And leaders of mega churches tend to think macro because there's so much. It's a big thing. And, to think of, ship analogy, it's like it's a huge cruise ship, right? Like you got to get all this stuff coordinated to get it moving and to keep it moving. And, often what gets lost is this thinking about the micro. How do we get people relationally connecting with one another? And then leaders, how do they not only get others to do it, but to start modeling it and do it themselves? Speak a little bit, Tony, about the systems and what systems you saw in the megachurch and whether that, in what ways it helped and in what ways maybe it hindered more disciple making.
Yes, a lot of research suggests that on staff at a church, if you want to grow through systems and people, you're going to have one staff member for every 100 people in the church. So
Uh,
in most churches, that means a lead pastor and a director of something, right? Or a
yeah,
couple, you might get 4 or 5, you might get a couple of part timers. But when you get to that mega church level, what ends up happening is that there are so many people coming in and out of the systems. There are so many people on staff. The church that I was talking about earlier, there were 30 people on staff.
wow,
And so we were running a pretty big ship. And in those staff meetings, it was like mini retreats. And I will tell you that if you were to go around and ask all 30 of us our definition of disciple and disciple making and even discipleship, uh, they would all have different answers.
yeah,
And it's no one's fault. It's just
yeah,
part of the cultural of systems, right? We need someone to oversee hospitality, someone to oversee finance and accounting, and all of those kind of things come together. And so those systems are great for bringing in lots of people, but it becomes really hard to get clear about pushing something like disciple making forward.
yeah,
To your ship analogy, I think that being a cruise liner is a great description. And the reality is, when we talk about disciple making, it's getting people to pick up the oar and start rowing.
yeah,
And it's
yeah,
really slow and it's really hard. And it's really hard to do that on a cruise ship. And so
yes,
that's the tension of something so big when what you really need is you really need someone who's sitting next to you on Sunday morning to pick up an oar and start rowing the boat to
yeah.
move people closer to Jesus.
Yep. Yep. And to be clear, right? Systems, there's not a bad thing. Like even small churches have systems and they're necessary. It's not,
We're a
right?
medium-sized church, and we have one staff person who oversees those systems.
Okay. Yeah.
And then we have another staff person, happens to be me, that oversees our disciple making culture.
Okay.
And so, what our lead pastor has done, wisely so, I would suggest, is he's elevated both people to like a um, equal levels on the leadership team. So we're both pushing for both sides,
Yeah.
both acknowledging that ultimately we want to be a church that makes disciple makers. But that's how we fight. That's how we fight the idea of I would call mission drift away from disciple making,
Okay.
is we give some of those voices key leadership positions.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's really important, right? Because if our systems get to a point where they're producing results that look like fruit without requiring relationship, that gets in the way of disciple making, right? So again, the systems, if they're in the way of producing fruit that comes out of relationship, that's a problem. So, we've kind of, I think, sketched out some of the unique problems of megachurches. Um, how to break through, right? What is a way that a megachurch can begin to lean more into disciple making? A megachurch can make some intentional movement towards that. Tony, I wrote a book on the foundation of disciple
Right.
making culture, and that book doesn't skew one way or another, mega church, small church. But here's the thing about it, right? If you are in a mega church, you still need a disciple making foundation. It's just like building, a shed though versus a skyscraper. Like
Yeah.
the foundation is principally going to be the same, but it's going to take so much more effort and work to set a foundation of that skyscraper than it would be to the shed. And so to set a foundation of disciple making, a core team, a few coordinated core teams in the situation of a megachurch, it's going to take a while. It's going to take a couple years just to get the foundation right. But if you don't get that foundation right, then whatever you're doing later on, it's not going to be able to support the weight of disciple making in that church. And so, I think one of the challenges for megachurches is having the perspective that a foundation that takes this type of effort and time is worth it when they're used to doing so much through scale and through speed and efficiency with these systems, that when they start to talk about disciple making, Jesus styled, relationally centered disciple making, a lot of them are just like, well, no, I don't, that doesn't fit who we are. But if they don't take that time, then they never get to those outcomes that they really want to get to, which is that personal transformation of those thousands of people
Yeah.
who are there. And so that's one of the big things, right? First thing I think of, man, if you want to start moving towards a disciple making culture in the megachurch, you have to take the time for that foundation of a disciple making core that will support what happens later on. Tony, what are some other things that you think of in terms of like, all right, how do we help mega churches move forward in disciple making?
Yeah, one of the things that we talked about a lot in church renewal when I was in seminary is this idea of a church within a church. And so it's almost becomes a sub movement inside of the larger movement. So, hey, all of these systems are happening, but also we're going to do something. We're going to kind of inspect what's working and not working internally and start to make some of those changes. You might call it like a fruit inspection, right? Like we're going to take some time, we're going to bring it in and we're going to say, hey, we like this part of who we are. We need to shift this part. And we're going to start developing a team of people. We call it a core team in the language that you and I use. And we're going to start really doing some of that work of fruit inspection. Willow Creek is a great example of that. The fact that Bill Hybels would come out and say, whether or not, Bill Hybels has had a long career full of ups and downs, but the humility it takes to come by and say, hey, we made a mistake. That's a big deal. That's a
Yeah.
big deal especially for a big church when he didn't have to. And I think that that's indicative of his heart of saying, hey, we looked at this and maybe we were just a little bit off. So, if you want to build a foundation, start looking for cracks.
Yeah. Yep. That's really true. Another thing that I think can help is kind of looking at the difference between what's happening publicly and what's happening privately. Right. So in a mega church with thousands of people around, like from the outside, it looks like everything is working. But the reality of those churches that I've seen and that I know others have been a part of and have heard from them, yeah, it's like any church. There's some things that are going really well. There's other things that are kind of in disarray. And if you're going to get down into disciple making, it needs to get down to personal transformation. And even when you think about the staff and the primary leader, like we should be able to see, or they should be able to see amongst themselves, like growth and, fruit of the spirit increasing in who they are. And if that's not happening, like oftentimes it's because they're depending too much on the systems to produce results as opposed to the spirits were in them and through them. And so how does that happen? Well, we have to put systems in their place and, again, don't abandon all the systems, but recovering personal ownership in the church life and life of the church. And what that can do is kind of provide a contrast, right? Of, hey, the systems can do certain things and they can't do other things. But let's lean into relationally what can happen when we're loving other people in relationship, when we're choosing to draw near to people in small spaces and our primary modes of ministry are not the mega, right? And again, primary, right? Nobody's saying you shouldn't have huge events or anything like that. Jesus had events with thousands of people, right?
Right.
Fed thousands at once. So there's nothing wrong or anti Jesus about those sorts of things. But we have to get down to the small and we have to get down to life on life to life transformation in the midst of those big, big contexts.
And the reality is that so much of what works in a mega church will work in disciple making.
Yep.
Um, and we have to really wrestle with the question, is our system producing the fruit that we want?
Yeah.
Are we pushing people in that direction? It's such an important thing for all church leaders to wrestle with. But the bigger the church, the harder the wrestle, because from a lot of perspectives, you're already crushing it. And we want you to keep crushing it and make disciples along the way. Justin, how about the takeaway and action step?
Yeah, our takeaway today is a church system that does not explicitly require relational obedience will unintentionally produce passive Christians. I'll say it again. A church system that does not explicitly require
Good.
relational obedience will unintentionally produce passive Christians. And our action step, hey, examine your church's outcomes and identify which ones will require relational obedience versus the ones that don't. And if you're having trouble finding those that require relational obedience, that should tell you something, right? Hey, friends who are in mega churches, we are cheering for you. We are for you. If there's anything else, I can speak on behalf of Navigators Church Ministries that we can do to help you to ask these questions, to begin the hard and long work of setting a foundation for disciple making that will last. Hey, reach out, contact us. You can reach out to me, you can reach out to Tony, you can reach out through the Navigators Church Ministries website. All those things are linked in the show notes. And we're thankful for you guys in the journey. And we're thankful for the part that mega churches play in the kingdom of God. Until next time, folks, we'll talk to you soon.